Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea, because today we are not just learning about history. We are stepping into it to feel its grit and its chill. Your community is not a collection of neighbors. It is your entire universe. The 50 or so faces you see every day are the only people you will likely ever know in your entire life. Let's consider the children. We've mentioned that childhood was short, but it's worth understanding what that meant in practice. From the age of about 7, a child was considered capable of contributing meaningful labor. Young boys would be tasked with scaring birds away from the newly sown fields or gathering firewood. Young girls would help with spinning, weeding the garden, or caring for younger siblings. Play was not a primary activity. It was something done in the brief moments between chores. The psychological impact of high infant mortality rates deserves deeper reflection. Imagine having 6 children and watching 3 of them die before the age of 5 from illness or accident. This was a common, expected tragedy. While grief was undoubtedly profound, the sheer frequency of loss must have fostered a different emotional landscape. Some historians argue this led to a certain emotional detachment from young children until they had passed the most dangerous early years. Let's focus on the sounds of suffering. In a world without painkillers, the sounds of pain would have been a common feature of village life. You would hear the cries of a woman in protracted, dangerous labor. You would hear the groans of someone suffering from a painful illness or a broken bone. You would hear the screams of someone having a tooth pulled or a wound cauterized with a hot iron. There was no way to mute this suffering. Pain was a public, audible event. The very earth beneath your feet was both your livelihood and a source of disease. Walking barefoot or in simple leather shoes on ground contaminated with animal and human feces created a constant risk of parasites like hookworm. These worms would enter the body through the skin of the feet, travel to the intestines, and cause chronic anemia and malnutrition. The soil you toiled in, the very source of your food, was simultaneously infecting you, slowly sapping your strength. Consider the nature of commerce for a peasant. While the manor was largely a subsistence economy, it was not entirely without cash. You might be able to sell surplus eggs, ale, or produce at a local market to earn a few pennies. This money was crucial for paying the various fees and taxes demanded by the lord. However, your ability to profit was severely limited. You had to have a surplus in the first place, which was rare. You needed permission to leave the manor to attend the market. The medieval worldview contained a different understanding of causality. If your crops failed, you wouldn't analyze soil composition or rainfall patterns. You would ask, what sin did I commit to anger God? Or has a neighbor with a grudge placed a curse on my field? This supernatural framework for understanding events meant that you felt you had some measure of control through prayer, penance, or counter-charms. However, it also created a world of deep-seated paranoia and social friction. Let's revisit the Black Death, but from the perspective of a survivor. Imagine your village has lost half its population. The fields are untended. The homes of your neighbors stand empty. You have survived, but you are surrounded by death and loss. In the aftermath, however, something strange happens. With the population drastically reduced, labor is suddenly in high demand. Lords are desperate for tenants and workers. For the first time, you have bargaining power. The role of the village church was not just spiritual. It was the social and administrative center of the community. It was where births were recorded through baptism, marriages were sanctified, and deaths were commemorated. The church porch was often where legal documents were witnessed and public announcements were made. The churchyard was not just a burial ground, but a public space where markets were sometimes held and villagers gathered. The church building itself was a source of immense civic pride. Let's consider the simple act of keeping warm. The open hearth in the center of the hut was inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up and out of the smoke hole. To stay warm at night, the entire family would huddle together on their straw mattresses, sharing body heat. They might also bring a heated stone from the fire, wrapped in cloth, into the bed with them. The concept of beauty would be vastly different. We find beauty in art and dramatic landscapes in complex designs. For a medieval peasant, beauty would be found in the practical and the providential. A field of healthy, ripening wheat was beautiful. A fat, healthy cow was beautiful. A sturdy, well-made wooden tool was beautiful. A clear sky at harvest time was beautiful. Beauty was not an abstract aesthetic quality. It was intrinsically linked to utility, abundance, and survival. The stone church in the distance is more than a building. It is the center of your world, a symbol of divine order in a chaotic existence, its bell marking the hours of your toil and your prayer. What about travel? For the vast majority of peasants, their entire world was a few square miles around their village. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and often forbidden. The roads were little more than muddy tracks, impassable in bad weather. Robbers and outlaws were a real threat. A peasant would need the lord's permission to leave the manor, which was rarely granted unless for a specific purpose like a pilgrimage. The prevalence of skin diseases would be another constant affliction. The lack of regular washing, the flea and lice infestations, and the poor diet would make the skin vulnerable to a host of ailments. Scabies, caused by mites burrowing into the skin, would cause intense, maddening itching. Fungal infections like ringworm were common. Bacterial infections of small cuts or sores could lead to impetigo or cellulitis. These conditions would be a source of chronic discomfort and disfigurement. The social hierarchy was visible in every interaction. You would not speak to your lord as an equal. You would avert your eyes, bow your head, and use deferential language. This performance of social status was not optional. It was a requirement for survival. The same deference was owed to the priest, to the reeve, and to any visiting noble or knight. This rigid etiquette reinforced the social order at every turn. You were constantly reminded of your lowly place in the great chain of being. Let's consider the concept of waste. In the medieval peasant economy, almost nothing was wasted. Old clothes were patched until they were threadbare, then used as rags. Food scraps were fed to the pigs or thrown into the pottage. Broken tools were repaired or repurposed. Animal bones could be carved into small tools or boiled for broth. Human and animal manure was a vital fertilizer for the garden plot. The bonds of kinship extended beyond the nuclear family. You were part of a wider network of cousins, aunts, and uncles, all living within the same small community. This extended family was a crucial social safety net. If your parents died, an aunt or uncle would likely take you in. If your ox died, you might be able to borrow one from a cousin. These kinship ties were a source of support, but also of obligation. Let's delve into the specifics of corvée labor. This wasn't just casual work. It was a formal, structured obligation. The reeve would assign the tasks that needed to be done on the lord's domain: plowing, sowing, weeding, and most critically, harvesting. The harvest work, known as boon work, was especially demanding. The entire village had to work to bring in the lord's crops first, before they could turn to their own strips. This was because the lord's harvest was the source of his wealth and power. The importance of salt cannot be overstated. In an era before refrigeration, salt was the primary method of preserving meat and fish. A salted pig could provide meat throughout the winter. Salt was a precious, and often expensive, commodity. It was so valuable that a lord might sometimes pay his workers with it, which is the origin of the word salary. For a peasant, having enough salt to preserve the meat from their 1 or 2 pigs was a major concern. The medieval peasant lived in a world of profound legal and social disabilities. As a serf, you could not bear arms or serve on a jury in a royal court. You were, in the eyes of the formal law outside the manor, a non-person. Your legal existence was mediated through your lord. If someone from outside the manor wronged you, it was your lord who would seek justice, as you were his property. This lack of legal standing was the ultimate expression of your powerlessness. Let's talk about the shoes on your feet, or the lack thereof. Many peasants, especially in the summer months, would have worked barefoot. The ground was rough, full of sharp stones and thorns. The risk of cuts and infections was constant. When shoes were worn, they were simple affairs, often made of a single piece of leather folded around the foot and secured with a thong. These turn shoes offered minimal protection and support. They would wear out quickly and were a significant expense for a poor family. The cycle of debt was another mechanism of control. A bad harvest might force you to borrow grain from the Lord's storehouse to feed your family and to have seed for the next planting. This loan would be repaid with interest after the next harvest, often at an exorbitant rate. A single bad year could put you in a cycle of debt that was impossible to escape, tying you ever more tightly to the Lord. This economic bondage was as powerful as the legal bonds of serfdom. And high on the hill, the Lord's castle looms. It is a promise of protection and a constant, stony reminder of your place. A reminder that your life, your labor, and your loyalty are not entirely your own. The world was also much quieter in terms of man-made noise. There was no engine hum, no traffic, no electronic buzz. This relative silence would make natural sounds much more prominent and at times more terrifying. The sudden crack of a lightning strike would be a deafening, awe-inspiring event. The howl of a wolf pack in the distance would carry for miles, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the dark. In this quiet world, every sound had meaning. The peasant's relationship with the church was complex. It was a source of comfort, community, and hope for a better afterlife. But it was also a source of economic burden through the tithe, and a source of psychological terror through the doctrine of hell. The church taught that the existing social order, with kings, lords, and peasants, was divinely ordained. To rebel against your lord was to rebel against God's will. What if a peasant showed exceptional intelligence? While formal education was out of reach, the church did provide a narrow path for social mobility. A bright, devout boy might catch the attention of the village priest. If the Lord gave his permission, and was often paid a fee for the loss of a laborer, the boy could be sent to a monastery to be educated as a monk or a priest. This was a rare opportunity to escape the life of agricultural toil. The concept of sanitation inside the hut requires a moment of stark realization. We've mentioned chamber pots, but let's be blunt. The straw that covered the floor and served as bedding was not changed daily. It would become compacted with dirt, spilled food, and human and animal waste. It was a perfect breeding ground for fleas, lice, and bacteria. Periodically, a fresh layer of straw might be laid on top. This lack of basic hygiene, so shocking to us, was simply the norm. The peasant's diet, while monotonous, had one advantage. It was high in fiber. The coarse, whole-grain bread and the abundance of peas and beans meant that their fiber intake was significantly higher than the average modern diet. While this might have been good for digestive health in some respects, it did little to offset the profound lack of essential vitamins and minerals. The reliance on a single crop, like rye in some regions or wheat in others, made the food supply incredibly vulnerable. The social life of the village tavern or alehouse was a vital part of the community, often run by a woman, an alewife. Out of her own home, it was the primary gathering place for men after a day's work. Here, they could socialize, exchange news and gossip, and enjoy the cloudy, nutritious ale that was a staple of the diet. The alehouse was a place of camaraderie and temporary escape from the hardships of daily life. The physical appearance of a medieval peasant would be startling to us. Their skin would be weathered and tanned by the sun, their faces lined with worry and the strain of physical labor from a young age. Many would be missing teeth. Their bodies would be thin and wiry from a meager diet and constant work, but with powerful muscles in their back, arms, and legs. Their hair would often be matted and unclean. Their clothes would be simple, patched, and stained. Let us imagine the first time a peasant might see a knight in full plate armor. This would be an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. The polished steel, the powerful warhorse, the gleaming sword. It was the embodiment of power and authority. This was the military technology that kept the feudal system in place. A single knight was a war machine, capable of dominating a dozen untrained peasants. The peasant's world was incredibly local. Your dialect, your customs, and even your genetic makeup would be specific to your small region. A peasant from one part of England might find the dialect of someone from just 50 miles away difficult to understand. This intense localism created strong community bonds, but also a deep suspicion of outsiders. A stranger was not just a stranger. They were a foreigner, someone from outside the known world of your valley or village. Let's focus on the specific danger of childbirth. For a peasant woman, it was one of the most dangerous moments of her life. The delivery would happen in her own hut, attended by a local midwife and other women from the village. The midwife's knowledge was based on tradition and experience, not medical science. Hygiene was non-existent. The risk of infection or puerperal fever was enormous. If the baby was in the wrong position, there was little that could be done. You taste the coarse, dark bread, gritty with milled stone. It is the taste of life itself, the primary fuel for a body that knows only work. It is bland, it is heavy, but it is sustenance. The concept of childhood play would be different. Children's games were often mimics of adult activities, preparing them for their future roles. Boys might play at fighting with sticks or build small shelters. Girls might make dolls from rags and play at running a household. They played games we might still recognize, like tag or blind man's bluff, but play was always secondary to work. A child's primary responsibility was to contribute to the family's survival. The ever-present smoke inside the hut had another consequence: poor vision. The constant irritation from the wood smoke would lead to chronic eye infections and inflammation. Over time, this, combined with poor nutrition, especially a lack of vitamin A, could contribute to a deterioration of eyesight. For the elderly, failing vision was a common and debilitating problem. In a world without corrective lenses, poor eyesight would make it difficult to perform essential tasks like mending tools or spinning thread. What about entertainment? Beyond the festival days and the storytelling around the fire, entertainment was simple and self-made. People sang songs while they worked songs that set a rhythm for tasks like scything or thrashing. Music was made with simple instruments like a wooden flute, a pipe, or a drum. A traveling minstrel or juggler might occasionally visit the village, providing a rare and exciting spectacle. The peasants' understanding of the natural world was intimate and practical. They knew which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous. They could read the weather from the sky and the wind. They understood the habits of the local wildlife. This knowledge was essential for survival, a form of science based on generations of observation and trial and error. However, this practical knowledge was interwoven with folklore and superstition. The sheer physical strength required for daily life is worth emphasizing again. A modern person who is considered fit from going to the gym would be unprepared for the functional, endurance-based strength of a medieval peasant. Their bodies were conditioned from childhood for a lifetime of heavy lifting, carrying, and repetitive manual labor. A peasant woman would regularly carry heavy buckets of water from the well, or large bundles of firewood. The lord of the manor was not necessarily a resident. He might be a great baron who owned dozens of manors and lived in a distant castle. In this case, the manor would be run by his appointed officials: the steward, who oversaw all the lord's properties; the bailiff, who managed the day-to-day operations of the manor; and the reeve, who was a peasant chosen to supervise the other peasants' work. The reeve was in a difficult position, caught between the demands of the lord and the needs of his fellow villagers. Communal oven, or banal oven, was another tool of control. Peasants were often forbidden from having their own ovens and were required to use the lord's for a fee. This fee could be paid in coin, or more often, by giving the lord's baker one of the loaves. While this provided a certain convenience, as the lord's oven was larger and more efficient, it was primarily a source of revenue for the lord. It was another small but significant way in which the peasant was prevented from being self-sufficient. Let's consider the emotional spectrum. While we focused on hardship and fear, it's vital to remember that these were complete human beings who experienced the full range of emotions. They felt joy at a good harvest, love for their family, pride in their work, and satisfaction in their community. They laughed at stories and jokes. The human spirit is resilient, and people find ways to experience happiness even in the most difficult circumstances. However, the context for these emotions was different. The landscape itself was a character in the peasant's life story. The hills, the streams, the forests, the fields, these were not just backdrops. They were the source of life, the arena of work, and the setting for folklore and memory. A particular old tree might be a landmark or a place associated with a local legend. A bend in the river might be a good fishing spot or a dangerous place where someone drowned. The landscape was imbued with meaning and history. The concept of justice could be harsh and swift. For a crime like theft, the punishment was often designed to be a public spectacle. The stocks or the pillory, located in the village center, were instruments of shame. The offender would be locked in place for hours or days, at the mercy of the villagers, who might throw rotten vegetables or refuse at them. This public humiliation was a powerful deterrent, reinforcing social norms through shame. The water you drink is drawn from a communal well or a nearby stream. It is cold and often cloudy, a vessel for life, but also unseen to your eyes, a carrier of sickness and death. The animals you shared your hut with were a constant source of parasites. Fleas from chickens and pigs and lice from other humans were an unavoidable part of life. The straw bedding teemed with them. You would be bitten constantly. The itching would be a torment, especially at night. Beyond the discomfort, these parasites were vectors for disease. Fleas could carry pathogens, including the bacteria that caused bubonic plague. Lice could transmit typhus. Let's re-examine the psychological state of feudalism. The belief that your station in life was ordained by God was not necessarily a source of despair. It could also be a source of comfort. It relieved you of the modern burden of choice and the pressure to succeed. Your path was set. Your duty was clear: to work the land, to raise a family, to serve your Lord and your God. By fulfilling these duties, you were playing your part in the divine plan. The sheer physical isolation of most villages meant that genetic diversity was limited. For generations, people married within their own small community or from a handful of neighboring villages. This led to the prevalence of certain hereditary conditions and a general lack of the genetic vigor that comes from a wider gene pool. While you would have no scientific understanding of this, the effects would be visible in the health and constitution of the community. The changing of the seasons dictated not just your work, but your entire sensory experience. Spring was the season of mud, of the smell of damp earth, and the exhausting work of plowing. Summer was the season of long, hot days, the smell of hay, and the race to bring in the harvest. Autumn was the season of slowing down, the smell of woodsmoke, the slaughter of pigs, and the preparation for winter. Winter was the season of cold and darkness, of huddling by the fire, of mending and spinning, and of waiting. The peasant's view of the nobility would have been a mixture of awe, resentment, and fear. The lord and his family were like beings from another world. They wore fine clothes, ate luxurious foods, and lived in a stone castle filled with unimaginable comforts. They were the source of law and protection, but also the source of an endless stream of taxes and demands. You might resent the lord for the hardships you endured, but you also depended on him for the stability of your world. Let's consider the simple act of making a fire. You would not have matches. You would need to use a flint and steel to create a spark, which would then be used to ignite a piece of tinder, like dry moss or charred cloth. From this, you would build up the flame to light the kindling and then the larger logs. This was a skill that was essential for survival. Letting the fire go out completely was a major inconvenience. The concept of retirement was, as we've noted, non-existent. However, there was a formal process for passing on land. When a peasant became too old to work his strips of land, he would formally hand them over to his son. The forest was a place of hidden bounties, beyond the lord's forbidden game. For a peasant, it was a source of nuts, berries, mushrooms, and wild herbs. These foraged foods were a crucial supplement to the monotonous diet, providing essential vitamins and a welcome variety of flavors. Knowing the forest and its resources was a vital skill, often passed down through generations. However, foraging was not without its risks. Mistaking a poisonous mushroom for an edible one could be fatal. The church's control over time was absolute. The calendar was a religious artifact. The days of the week were named for gods that had been superseded, but were still part of the culture. The year was dated from the birth of Christ. The major turning points of the year were religious festivals. Even the hours of the day were marked by the church bell's call to prayer. This religious framing of time meant that even the most mundane aspects of your life were situated within a sacred context. The social pressure to marry and have children was immense. A single, childless adult was an anomaly and an economic liability. A man needed a wife to run the household, and a woman needed a husband for support and social standing. Both needed children to provide labor and care in their old age. There was little room for personal choice in this matter. Marriages were arranged, and the expectation to procreate was absolute. Think of the colors of this world. Not the vibrant dyes of a king's court, but the muted browns of the soil, the greens of the fields, and the gray of a winter sky. A pallet of humble earth. The peasant's world was incredibly fragile. We've discussed the major threats like famine and plague, but even small-scale disasters could be catastrophic. A fire could destroy the mill, meaning no one could grind their grain. A disease could sweep through the village's oxen, making plowing impossible. A violent hailstorm could flatten the crops in the fields just before harvest. The margin for error was razor-thin. In summary, the life of a medieval peasant was a constant negotiation with hardship. It was a life of relentless labor, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to disease and violence. It was a life lived within a rigid social and economic structure that offered little freedom or opportunity. But it was also a life of deep community bonds, rich oral culture, and a powerful sense of meaning derived from faith and tradition. Let us explore the concept of warfare from the peasant's perspective. For the nobles, war was a source of glory, honor, and potential wealth. For the peasant, it was an unmitigated disaster. When armies marched, they lived off the land. This meant they would requisition food, livestock, and supplies from the villages they passed through, often without compensation. This was known as chevauchée, a brutal tactic of raiding and pillaging designed to weaken the enemy's economy. The communal nature of the open field system also meant a communal vulnerability to pests. A swarm of locusts or a blight that affected the wheat crop would devastate the entire village's food supply. There were no pesticides or advanced agricultural techniques to combat these threats. Peasants would rely on prayer, religious processions, and folk rituals to try and ward off these natural disasters. The priest might be called upon to formally excommunicate the pests. The concept of cleanliness is relative. While the peasant's environment was filthy by our standards, they would not have perceived it as such. It was simply the way things were. They did make efforts to maintain some order. The floor of the hut might be swept, and rushes or herbs were sometimes strewn on the floor to cover the worst of the smells and provide some insulation. Personal washing was infrequent and basic, perhaps a quick wipe with a damp cloth or a dip in a stream in the summer. Let's consider the crime of poaching in more detail. The forests and rivers teemed with food, deer, boar, rabbits, fish, that was legally the property of the lord. For a peasant on the brink of starvation, the temptation to hunt this game was immense. This is why the forest laws were so harsh. They were designed to protect the lord's exclusive privilege and a valuable economic asset. Special forest courts with their own set of laws and punishments were established to enforce these rules. The peasant's mental map of the world would be radically different from ours. It would be centered on the village church. From there, it would radiate out to the familiar fields, the common pasture, the woods, and the neighboring villages. This was their known world. Beyond that lay a vague and largely imagined geography, populated by famous cities like London or Rome, and holy places like Jerusalem, all known only through stories. There were no accurate maps available to them. The legal status of a serf was hereditary. If your parents were serfs, you were born a serf. Your status was not a result of your actions or abilities. It was an inherited condition. This lack of social mobility was the defining feature of the feudal system. It created a society that was stable and predictable, but also deeply stagnant and unjust from a modern perspective. The sounds of nature would have been much more integrated into daily life. The peasant would have been intimately familiar with the songs of different birds, knowing which ones signaled the coming of spring or the time of day. The buzzing of bees was a sign of a healthy ecosystem needed for pollination. The croaking of frogs in the evening was a normal part of the soundscape. The role of the village blacksmith was crucial. He was the master of the forge, the one who could work the precious material of iron. He made and repaired the essential iron parts of the plows, as well as sickles, axes, and other tools. He also shoed the horses and oxen. The blacksmith's forge was often a social center, a place of warmth and activity. His skills were vital to the entire village's agricultural economy. Your home is a shelter woven from the land itself, wattle, daub, and thatch. It keeps out the worst of the wind and rain, but it shares its warmth with the smoke from the fire and the animals you live with. Let's focus on the psychological impact of living with no privacy. In the one-room hut, there was no personal space. A married couple's intimacy would occur in the same room where their children and parents were sleeping. Sickness, death, and childbirth were all public family events. This constant, unavoidable proximity to others would forge incredibly strong family bonds, but it would also create a situation where there was no escape from social friction or personal conflict. The cycle of feasts and fasts dictated by the church had a significant impact on the peasants' diet and health. The period of Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a time of strict fasting. Meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. This meant a long period on an even more restricted diet, which could be particularly hard at the end of winter when food stores were already low. Conversely, the great feasts of Christmas and Easter were times of rare indulgence, when meat and richer foods were consumed. The peasants' understanding of numbers would be simple and practical. They would be able to count their livestock and measure their grain, but complex mathematics was the domain of scholars and merchants. Their sense of numbers was tied to tangible things. They might count using their fingers and toes, or by making notches on a stick. The abstract concepts of fractions or negative numbers would be meaningless. The fear of damnation was a powerful psychological force. Sermons and church art vividly depicted the torments of hell, eternal fire, grotesque demons, and unending suffering. This was not a metaphor. It was presented as a literal, physical reality that awaited sinners after death. This terror was a primary motivator for religious observance, for confession of sins, and for obedience to the church's teachings. The simple act of obtaining salt could be a major undertaking. While some regions had local salt pans or mines, many communities had to import it. This made it a valuable trade good. A peasant might have to barter a significant portion of their surplus produce at market to obtain the salt needed to preserve their winter meat. The lord often controlled the trade and sale of salt, taxing it as another source of revenue. Let's reconsider the animals that lived in the hut. This practice of cohabitation, known as byre-dwelling, was common in many parts of Europe. While it provided security for the animals and some extra warmth for the humans, the health consequences were severe. The constant proximity to animal feces exposed the family to a range of zoonotic diseases and parasites. The ammonia from the urine would have created a foul stench and contributed to the respiratory problems caused by the smoke. The concept of social mobility was not entirely absent, but the paths were few and narrow. We've mentioned the church. Another route was the military. A strong, young peasant might be recruited into a lord's retinue as a foot soldier or an archer. If he proved himself brave and capable in battle, he might gain some reward or status. However, this was an incredibly risky path, with a high chance of death or disabling injury. The psychological impact of being illiterate in a world where ultimate authority came from a book, the Bible, is worth considering. The Word of God was inaccessible to you directly. You relied entirely on the priest's interpretation. This created a relationship of absolute intellectual and spiritual dependency. The priest held the keys to the kingdom of knowledge and salvation. This power dynamic reinforced the church's authority and the peasants' sense of their own ignorance. Let's look at the community from a different angle: conflict. In such a close-knit, interdependent society, personal disputes could fester and become serious problems. A disagreement over the boundary of a land strip, an accusation of theft, or a simple personal dislike could poison relationships within the village. The manorial court was there to settle these disputes, but resentments could linger for generations. The peasants' clothes were not just simple, they were a uniform of their class. The colors were muted earth tones because complex dyes were expensive. The fabric was coarse wool or linen, not the fine silks or velvets of the nobility. The style was simple and functional. Your clothing immediately marked you as a peasant. This visual coding of the social hierarchy was inescapable. It was another constant reminder of your place in society. The concept of privacy is a foreign one. Your life is an open book, lived in a single room with your entire family, where every joy, sorrow, and sickness is a shared, unavoidable experience. The physical landscape was much more wooded than it is today. Large swathes of Europe were covered in thick forests and marshes. This made travel difficult and provided cover for outlaws and predators. But it also meant that wood was a more abundant resource for fuel and building. The process of clearing the forests for agriculture, the great clearances of the High Middle Ages, was a monumental task undertaken by generations of peasants with simple axes and saws. The medieval peasant's world was one of stark contrasts. There was the profound darkness of the night and the brilliant light of the sun. There was the back-breaking labor of the weekdays and the communal joy of the holy days. There was the ever-present threat of death and the deep faith in an eternal afterlife. There was the grinding poverty of their own lives and the unimaginable wealth of the lords and the church. Living in this world required a mental fortitude to navigate these extremes. Let's consider the specific tools of the harvest in more detail. The sickle was a small, curved blade that was used to cut grain stalk by stalk. It was slow and required the user to be constantly bent over, but it was efficient at gathering every last bit of grain with minimal loss. The scythe was a much larger tool that could clear a field more quickly but required more strength and skill, and it could cause more of the precious grain to be lost. The peasant's relationship with the law was one of submission. The law was not seen as a system for protecting their rights, but as a set of rules imposed from above to maintain order and protect the property of the powerful. The punishments were harsh and public, designed to inspire fear and obedience. While the manorial court dealt with local issues, the peasant had little recourse against the lord himself. The lord was, in many respects, above the law as it applied to his serfs. The lack of scientific understanding led to some strange and ineffective medical treatments. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, dominated medical thought. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these humors. The treatment was therefore to rebalance them, often through bloodletting or purges. A peasant with a fever might be bled by a barber surgeon, a procedure that would actually weaken them and make them more susceptible to the infection. The social role of gossip was incredibly important in a pre-literate society. It was the primary way that news, information, and social norms were circulated. It could build or destroy a reputation. An accusation of immoral behavior, spread through gossip, could lead to social ostracism. A story of a neighbor's good fortune or misfortune was a source of entertainment and a lesson in how to behave. The sheer physical effort of cooking a meal was immense. Water had to be hauled from the well. Firewood had to be gathered and chopped. The fire itself had to be started and tended. Grain had to be ground into flour. Vegetables had to be cleaned and chopped with a simple knife. The pottage had to be stirred constantly to prevent it from burning to the bottom of the cauldron. Let us focus on the Harriet or death tax. When the head of a peasant household died, the lord was entitled to claim their best beast, be it an ox, a cow, or a horse. For a family that had just lost its primary worker, this was a devastating economic blow. It could cripple their ability to farm their land and threaten their survival. This tax was a stark reminder that even in death, the peasant was not free from their obligations to the lord. The world of the peasant was animated by a belief in miracles. Saints were not just historical figures, they were active intercessors in the daily world. If a child was sick, you would pray to a specific saint known for healing. If you were going on a journey, you would pray for protection. The relics of saints, a piece of bone, a scrap of clothing, were believed to possess divine power and were housed in churches and shrines that became major pilgrimage sites. The peasants' contribution to the economy was the foundation of the entire medieval world. The surplus grain they produced fed the lords, the knights, the priests, and the growing populations of the towns. Their labor built the castles and the cathedrals. Their taxes funded the wars of kings. The entire glittering superstructure of medieval society, its art, its architecture, its chivalric culture, its theology, rested on the bent back of the peasant. The rhythm of the day is a prayer in motion, a prayer for sun, a prayer for rain in its proper time, a prayer for health, a prayer to simply see the next sunrise after a long, cold night. The concept of a weekend is a modern invention. For the medieval peasant, the week was structured around one day of rest, Sunday. This was a day of religious obligation when attendance at church was mandatory. Work was forbidden. This weekly respite was essential for physical and spiritual recovery. It was the one day when the relentless cycle of labor was broken. However, essential tasks like tending to livestock still had to be done. The holy day was a pause, not a complete stop. The peasant's sense of history would have been very different from ours. It would not be a linear narrative of dates and events, but a cyclical, mythic understanding of the past. They would know the stories of the Bible, the lives of the saints, and the local legends of their own village. Their sense of time was shallow. The world of their grandparents was much like their own. The deep past was the time of Christ or the time of ancient, half-remembered pagan kings. The village ale, or beer, was more than just an alcoholic beverage. It was a vital part of the diet. It was often safer to drink than water, as the brewing process killed many of the pathogens. It was also a significant source of calories, made from the same grains that were used for bread. It was a thick, nutritious, low-alcohol beverage that was consumed by men, women, and even children. The alewife, the woman who brewed and sold the ale, was a central figure in the village economy. The intense physical closeness of village life meant that infectious diseases could spread like wildfire. A cough or a sneeze could easily transmit influenza or tuberculosis through a family huddled in a small hut. Contagious childhood diseases like measles or smallpox would sweep through a village, often with devastating mortality rates. There was no concept of quarantine or social distancing. The peasants' relationship with their lord's wife, the lady of the manor, could also be significant. The lady was responsible for running the internal household of the castle, managing the servants, and overseeing the production of textiles and other goods. She was often seen as a potential intercessor with the Lord, a softer, more approachable figure who might be appealed to for mercy or aid. In popular literature, the lady was often depicted as a figure of grace and charity. The sheer darkness of the medieval night is something we cannot truly replicate. Without the pervasive glow of electric lights, the night sky would have been breathtakingly brilliant. The Milky Way would have been a vivid swathe across the heavens. The stars and planets would have seemed intensely close and bright. This spectacular celestial display was the backdrop for a rich astrology and folklore, but the darkness on the ground was absolute and terrifying. The peasant's life was lived on a human scale. Everything was made by hand. Food was grown locally. The community was small enough that you knew everyone by name. This created a world that was, in some ways, more comprehensible than our own vast, complex, and often anonymous society. There was a direct, tangible connection between your labor and your survival. You saw the fruits of your work in the grain you harvested and the bread you ate. Let's focus on the role of the reeve. As a peasant chosen to supervise other peasants, he was in an unenviable position. He was responsible to the Lord for ensuring the work was done and the rents were collected. If the harvest was poor or the peasants were uncooperative, he would face the Lord's anger. At the same time, he was a member of the village community. His neighbors and kin might resent him for enforcing the Lord's will. The texture of medieval life was rough. The clothes were scratchy wool. The bread was gritty. The floor was hard-packed earth. The tool handles were rough wood. There were few soft, smooth, or comfortable surfaces in a peasant's world. This constant, low-level sensory abrasion would have been another source of physical stress. The modern world is obsessed with comfort, with soft fabrics, smooth surfaces, and ergonomic designs. We have engineered the roughness out of our environment. The peasant's understanding of wealth was tied directly to land and livestock. A wealthy peasant was one who had a larger landholding, an extra ox, or a few more sheep than his neighbors. Coin was a secondary form of wealth, used for specific transactions but not the primary measure of a person's substance. This agrarian conception of wealth is fundamentally different from our modern financialized one. Pain is a constant companion. A toothache, a strained back, a cut from a tool. There is no relief, only endurance. It is a part of life as certain as the turning of the seasons. The emotional release of a village festival was essential for psychological survival. For a few days a year, the normal rules were relaxed. There was abundant food and drink. There were games, music, and dancing. These were moments of pure, communal joy, a temporary escape from the daily grind. The church sanctioned these festivals, but they often had deep roots in older, pagan celebrations of the seasons. The peasant's world was one of limited choices. Your profession was chosen for you by your birth. Your spouse was often chosen for you by your family. Your place of residence was determined by your lord. The food you ate was determined by the season and the harvest. This lack of choice, so alien to our modern culture of endless options, was a fundamental aspect of their existence. It created a life of great predictability, but also one of profound constraint. The practice of gleaning was a crucial part of the peasant's subsistence. After the lord's and the peasant's harvests were complete, the poor, especially widows and children, were traditionally allowed to go into the fields and gather any stray ears of grain that had been missed. This was a recognized social safety net, a form of institutionalized charity. The small amount of grain gathered through gleaning could make the difference between survival and starvation for the most vulnerable members of the community. Let's consider the impact of a simple toothache. In a world without effective painkillers, a severe toothache would be a form of torture. It would make it difficult to eat, to sleep, or to concentrate on work. The pain could last for days or weeks. The only solution was extraction, a brutal procedure performed without anesthetic. Many people would simply endure the pain for as long as possible. This kind of chronic, debilitating pain was a common experience. The peasants' faith was often very tangible and localized. While they were part of the Universal Catholic Church, their primary focus was on their local parish church and its patron saint. They might make pilgrimages not to Rome, but to a nearby shrine where a local saint's relic was kept. Their religious experience was deeply tied to their physical place in the world. The sheer amount of time a peasant spent walking is staggering. They walked to the fields. They walked between their scattered strips of land. They walked to the woods to gather fuel. They walked to the well for water. They walked to the neighboring village for a market or a festival. In a world without mechanical transportation, the human body was the primary mode of conveyance. This meant that the peasant's world was necessarily small, limited by the distance a person could comfortably walk in a day. The peasant's view of nature was deeply ambivalent. It was the source of their sustenance, the provider of sun and rain that made the crops grow. But it was also a source of terror, of destructive storms, droughts, floods, and predatory animals. Nature was not a gentle, benevolent force to be admired from a distance. It was a powerful, unpredictable entity that had to be worked with, placated, and feared. The system of inheritance, where land was passed down from father to son, was crucial for family continuity. But what happened if a peasant had only daughters? In some places, a daughter could inherit the land, and her husband would take on the responsibility of working it. In other places, the land might pass to a more distant male relative or revert to the Lord. This made the birth of a son a matter of great economic and social importance. The medieval peasant lived in a world without insurance. If your hut burned down, there was no policy to help you rebuild. If your ox died, there was no compensation. If a hailstorm destroyed your crops, there was no crop insurance to cover your losses. Your only safety net was the support of your family and your community. A village might come together to help a family rebuild a hut, or a neighbor might lend you their ox. The peasant's world was one of profound silence in ways we can't imagine. At night, in the absence of any man-made hum, the quiet would be absolute. This deep silence could be peaceful but also unsettling. It made any small sound, a creak, a footstep, a howl, stand out in stark relief. This lack of background noise would have made them much more attuned to their auditory environment. We will journey back to a time shrouded in mist and myth, a world lit only by fire and faith, a world where the rhythm of your life was dictated not by a clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun. Childhood as we know it does not exist. It is a brief apprenticeship for a life of hardship. From the moment you can walk and carry, you are put to work, learning the tasks that will define your existence. The social interactions in a village were governed by a complex, unwritten code of conduct. You knew who you could joke with, who you had to show deference to, and who you owed a favor. These intricate social rules were learned from childhood and were essential for navigating village life. A modern person, dropped into this environment, would be a social bull in a china shop, constantly violating unspoken norms and causing offense without realizing it. The peasant's life was lived almost entirely in public. The one-room hut offered no privacy from family. The work in the common fields was done in full view of the neighbors. The church services, the festivals, the court sessions, all were public communal events. The concept of a private life, of a sphere of existence that is separate from the public gaze, was largely absent. This would be a profound shock to the modern psyche, which places a high value on individuality and privacy. Let's focus on the specific physical toll on the body. A lifetime of bending over to weed fields or cut grain would lead to chronic lower back pain and spinal degeneration. Kneeling on the hard ground would destroy the cartilage in the knees. The repetitive motions of swinging a scythe or a flail would lead to arthritis in the shoulders, elbows, and wrists. The peasant's skeleton, if we examine it today, is a record of their labor, showing the immense stress placed upon it. The world outside the village was a source of both fear and fascination. A traveling merchant with exotic goods, a pilgrim with stories from a distant shrine, a friar with news from the wider church. These visitors were a source of excitement and a rare link to the world beyond the horizon. They brought new objects, new ideas, and new stories into the closed world of the village. For a brief time, the peasant's world would expand, filled with the possibility of other ways of life. The peasant's diet was not just meager, it was dangerously reliant on the annual grain harvest. This single event determined whether the village would eat or starve for the next 12 months. The anxiety leading up to the harvest was immense. Would the weather hold? Would the yield be enough? The celebration after a successful harvest was one of profound relief. But if the harvest failed, the consequences were immediate and terrifying. The church provided a moral framework that, while often used to enforce the social order, also placed some constraints on the powerful. The concepts of charity, mercy, and justice were central to Christian teaching. A lord who was excessively cruel or unjust to his peasants risked not only their resentment but also divine punishment and a reputation for being a bad Christian. While this did not prevent exploitation, it did, in some cases, moderate the worst excesses of the system. The peasant's sense of self was deeply communal. An individual's identity was derived from their membership in a family and a village. When asked who they were, a peasant might reply, "I am John, son of William from this village." Their personal identity was inseparable from their relationships and their place. The modern concept of an autonomous individual, defined by their personal choices and achievements, would have been very strange. The lack of clean water for hygiene had consequences beyond the spread of disease. It meant that wounds were almost impossible to keep clean. A simple cut or scrape would be contaminated with dirt and bacteria from the very beginning. The body's immune system was the only line of defense. Infection was the rule, not the exception. The peasant's body would be a landscape of scars from injuries that, in our world, would have healed cleanly with basic first aid. The psychological effect of seeing the Lord's castle every day cannot be underestimated. It was a permanent, unyielding symbol of power, built of stone while your own hut was made of mud and sticks. It represented a different order of existence, one of security, wealth, and authority. Its presence on the horizon was a constant, silent reminder of your place in the world. It was a physical manifestation of the feudal system, a daily lesson in the reality of who held the power. The peasant's life was dictated by an endless series of obligations. You had an obligation to your family to provide for them. You had an obligation to your Lord to provide him with labor and rent. You had an obligation to the church to provide it with a tithe. You had an obligation to your community to participate in the collective work and social life. Your life was a web of duties. The modern concept of a life based on the pursuit of individual rights and freedoms would be completely alien. The boundary between the natural and supernatural is thin, almost non-existent. A sudden illness is a curse. A strange sound in the night is a bad omen. A folk remedy is as trusted as a prayer. Let's consider the simple joy of sunlight. In a world with no electric light and with homes that were dark and smoky, the sun was a source of immense pleasure and relief. A warm, sunny day meant you could work outside without being cold. It meant the interior of the hut might be brighter. It meant the crops were growing. The sun was a powerful, positive force associated with life, health, and God's favor. The peasant's world was one of intense physical intimacy, not by choice but by necessity. Huddling together for warmth, sleeping in close quarters, working side by side in the fields, all of it meant a constant physical contact with other people. This would foster a certain comfort with physical closeness, but it also meant there was no escape from the bodies of others. You were constantly aware of the sounds, smells, and presence of your family and neighbors. The medieval peasant was a master of improvisation and repair. In a world where new goods were rare and expensive, nothing was thrown away if it could be fixed. A broken tool handle would be replaced. A torn garment would be patched. A leaky roof would be rethatched. This make do and mend culture was a vital survival skill. It required ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a deep, practical knowledge of materials. The peasant's experience of time was not just cyclical, it was also patient. You planted a seed and had to wait months for it to grow. You bred a cow and had to wait for it to mature. The rhythms of life were slow, governed by the pace of nature, not the speed of machines. This would have fostered a sense of patience and long-term thinking that is often absent in our world of instant gratification. You could not rush the harvest. You could not speed up the changing of the seasons. Let us contemplate the profound resilience that this life required. To wake up every day to a life of backbreaking labor, to face the constant threats of hunger and disease, to endure the loss of children, and to do it all with little hope of personal advancement. This required a strength of spirit that is almost unimaginable. This resilience was not a choice. It was a necessity. It was forged in the crucible of hardship and passed down through generations. The end of a peasant's life was typically as public as its beginning. A dying person would be surrounded by their family. The priest would be called to administer the last rites, a crucial sacrament to prepare the soul for its journey to the afterlife. After death, the body would be washed and wrapped in a simple shroud by the women of the family. The wake, a vigil held before the funeral, was a time for the community to come and pay their respects, to mourn, and to support the grieving family. The peasant's world was also a world without clocks, calendars on the wall, or news feeds. Their understanding of the present moment was not cluttered with information about distant events or anxieties about a future they couldn't control. Their focus was immediate and local: the weather, the state of the crops, the health of their family. While this meant a life of great ignorance about the wider world, it may also have meant a life of greater presence in the moment. The very soil that the peasant worked was not their own. This is a fundamental fact that shaped their entire existence. The land belonged to the Lord. The peasant had a right to use their strips of land, a right that was often hereditary, but they did not have ownership. They could not sell the land or leave it to whomever they chose. This lack of ownership meant they could never build true, independent wealth. The fear of strangers, or xenophobia, was a logical survival mechanism in the peasant's world. A stranger could be a carrier of disease, a thief, a fugitive, or a scout for a rival lord's army. In a small, closed community where everyone was known, an outsider was an unpredictable and potentially dangerous element. While hospitality was also a Christian virtue, it was always tempered with a deep-seated suspicion. The peasant's mental toolkit for dealing with suffering was largely spiritual. When faced with a tragedy, the death of a child, a failed harvest, the primary recourse was to prayer, penance, and faith in God's plan. This provided a framework for making sense of what might otherwise seem like random, meaningless cruelty. Suffering could be seen as a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or a way to share in the suffering of Christ and thus earn a place in heaven. Light is a precious commodity. A flickering tallow candle or the glow of the hearth fire pushes back the immense, pressing darkness of the night, a darkness filled with imagined and real fears. The physical environment of the peasant was an organic one. Their houses were made of wood, mud, and straw. Their tools were mostly wood. Their clothes were wool and linen. Their world was built from the materials of the surrounding landscape. There were very few synthetic or manufactured materials. This meant that their environment was biodegradable and in many ways more integrated with the natural world. But it also meant that it was less durable. Huts required constant repair. Let's consider the joy of a wedding. A wedding was a major social event in the village. It was a time of feasting, dancing, and celebration that could last for several days. It represented the formation of a new family unit, the promise of continuity for the community. While the marriage itself was often a practical arrangement, the wedding was a moment of genuine, collective happiness. The peasant's immune system would have been both stronger and more battered than ours. From birth, they were exposed to a huge range of pathogens in the water, the soil, and the air. This would have forced their immune systems to be constantly active, building up resistance to many common local infections. However, they were also weakened by poor nutrition and the constant stress of physical labor. The oral culture of the peasant village was its library, its internet, and its movie theater all rolled into one. The stories, songs, proverbs, and riddles that were shared around the fire contained the community's collective wisdom, its history, its morality, and its entertainment. A person with a good memory and a talent for storytelling was a valuable cultural asset. This rich, vibrant oral tradition was completely independent of the written culture of the elites. The sheer physical boredom of many tasks is hard to overstate. Weeding a field, thrashing grain with a flail, spinning thread on a drop spindle. These were repetitive, monotonous tasks that had to be performed for hours on end. The peasant would have developed a mental fortitude to cope with this monotony, perhaps by singing, praying, or simply letting their mind wander. Ultimately, the peasant's life was defined by a lack of control. They could not control the weather, the ultimate arbiter of their fate. They could not control the diseases that afflicted their families and livestock. They could not control the demands of their lord or the outbreak of war. They could not control their own social or economic destiny. Their lives were lived at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. Loyalty is not an abstract virtue. It is a chain of obligation. You are loyal to your family, your village, your lord, and your God, because to be outside this chain is to be utterly and dangerously alone. The world beyond your village is a place of rumor and legend. Tales of distant cities or foreign wars are like fairy tales, spoken by the rare traveler, a glimpse into a universe you will never see. You measure your wealth not in coin, but in bushels of wheat, in the health of your ox, in the number of children who survive past infancy. This is the real currency of the medieval world. Freedom is not a right you are born with. It is a distant concept, something belonging to nobles and churchmen. Your life is bound to the land, and the land is bound to your lord. The sound of a horseman approaching could mean anything: a message from the lord, a traveling friar, or a soldier demanding tax or worse. It is a sound that brings all work to a sudden, anxious halt. Sickness is not a medical condition. It is a moral one. It is often seen as a punishment from God, a test of faith, or the work of malevolent forces you must ward off with charms and pleas. The passing of a loved one is a common, heartbreaking sorrow. The graves in the churchyard are filled with infants and young mothers. Grief is a familiar cloak, worn by everyone in the village. Imagine the silence, not the gentle quiet of a country retreat, but a profound, deep silence, broken only by the wind in the trees, the cry of a bird, or the distant tolling of a church bell. You find joy not in possessions, but in moments. The successful harvest, the birth of a healthy calf, a wedding feast, the brief, sun-drenched respite of a holy day. Small sparks in the gloom. The forest edge is a line of demarcation. Within it lies firewood and forage, but also the Lord's deer, which are forbidden to you upon pain of mutilation or death. It is a place of temptation and terror. Time moves differently here. It is cyclical, not linear. The year is a wheel of planting, growing, harvesting, and waiting. Your life follows the same pattern, a loop of labor from which there is no escape. You see your own reflection only rarely, perhaps in a still puddle or a polished piece of metal. The face that looks back is weathered by sun and worry, a stranger you know intimately. The world is full of sounds we have forgotten. The creak of a wooden cart, the rhythmic thud of a flail on the thrashing floor, the chatter of dozens of birds in the thatch of your own roof. Your knowledge is practical, passed down through generations. You know the soil, the weather, the habits of animals. But you cannot read the words in the priest's Bible, a holy book that remains a mystery. A stranger is an object of deep suspicion. Are they a pilgrim, a beggar, a fugitive, or a carrier of disease? Their presence disrupts the delicate balance of your small, isolated world. The law is not an abstract system of justice. It is the Lord's will. The manorial court settles disputes over land and livestock, and its punishments are swift, public, and designed to enforce obedience. The coming of winter is a time of great anxiety. Is the harvest large enough? Is there enough firewood? Will the roof hold? It is a battle for survival against the cold and the dark. Hope is a fragile thing, often placed not in this life, but in the next. The priest speaks of a paradise for the faithful and righteous, a release from the toil and sorrow of this earthly existence. Picture a sky untainted by pollution, so dark that the stars were a brilliant, terrifying tapestry. They were not distant suns to you, but divine portents, omens of fortune or famine, watched with hope and fear. The future is not something you plan for with ambition. It is something you prepare for with pragmatism. You expect your life to be exactly like that of your parents, and your children's lives to be like yours. The taste of ale, brewed in the village, is a taste of celebration and community. It is a cloudy, nutritious drink that offers a moment of cheer and a brief escape from the drudgery of the everyday. The concept of a day off does not exist. There are holy days, festivals mandated by the church, but every other day is a workday, from the first light of dawn until the last light fades from the sky. You live in a world of constant, low-level fear. Fear of a bad harvest, fear of disease, fear of the Lord's anger, fear of divine punishment. This anxiety is the background noise of your life. Marriage is not about romance. It is a practical alliance between families, a means of securing land, labor, and the continuation of your line. Affection may grow, but it is not the foundation. The stories told around the fire at night are your entertainment and your education. They are tales of saints, of local legends, of cunning animals and foolish devils, weaving a rich tapestry of oral culture. You trust in the strength of your own body, the solidarity of your family, and the mercy of God. These are the three pillars that hold up your world, and if one should fail, the others are sorely tested. The simplicity of this life, which might seem romantic from a distance, is a brutal illusion. It is a simplicity born not of choice, but of a complete and utter lack of alternatives. This world is not a distant, dusty chapter in a book. It was the lived, breathed, felt reality for the overwhelming majority of our ancestors. Their resilience is written into our very DNA. Forget everything you think you know about the past. Forget the fairy tales of knights and princesses. We are about to confront the raw, unfiltered reality of a life of profound and relentless hardship. Feel the earth beneath your feet, not through the sole of a shoe, but as a cold, damp reality. It is the source of all life and all struggle, the very soil you are bound to from birth until death. So the question we must now face, having glimpsed this world, is not just what it was like, but could you, with all your modern knowledge and sensibilities, survive even a single day in their world? Let's find out. To truly understand why you wouldn't survive, we must begin at the very start of a medieval peasant's day, an experience that would be an immediate and visceral shock to the modern system. Your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the first, faint hint of gray light in the sky, well before the sun has risen. There is no gentle awakening. You are roused by the bitter cold seeping through the thin walls of your wattle and daub hut. With the most basic needs met, your thoughts would turn to breakfast. Forget coffee, toast, or cereal. The first meal of the day, if you are fortunate enough to have one, is profoundly monotonous. It would likely be a piece of coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, so hard you might need to soften it in water, or the thin, weak ale that serves as a primary source of hydration and calories. More likely, you would consume leftover pottage from the night before. Now dressed in your only set of clothes, a simple tunic of coarse, undyed wool or linen, perhaps with leggings or braids, you step out of your hut into the pre-dawn gloom. The work begins instantly. There is no commute, no easing into the day. For the vast majority of the year, your life is dictated by the agricultural calendar, and the tasks are relentless. Let us imagine it is plowing season in the spring. The sheer physicality of every single task is a detail we often overlook. When we imagine farming, we might picture a gentle, rustic activity. The reality was a form of brutal manual labor that has almost no modern equivalent. Consider the harvest. You would be in the field with a sickle or a scythe, a tool that requires immense skill and strength to wield effectively for hours on end. You would be bent over from dawn until dusk, cutting wheat stalk by stalk. Beyond the exhaustion, you must contend with the ever-present risk of injury. The tools were simple, heavy, and unforgiving. A slip of a scythe could sever a finger or slice open a leg. Handling a powerful ox could result in being gored or trampled. Even a simple splinter from a wooden tool could be a death sentence. In our world, a deep cut or a puncture wound is a treatable inconvenience. As the sun reaches its zenith, you might get a short break for a midday meal. This would not be a leisurely lunch. You would eat in the field, stopping your work for only a brief period. The meal would be a repeat of breakfast, more dark bread, perhaps a piece of hard cheese if it was a good year, and an onion. This was it. This was the fuel to get you through the second half of a grueling day. All the while, you are under the watchful eye of the reeve, the Lord's appointed official who was, in essence, the village foreman. Let's talk about your home, the place you return to after the day's labor is done. The typical peasant hut or cruck house was a single-room dwelling, perhaps 10 by 20 feet in size. The floor was simply packed earth, which would turn to mud in wet weather. There were no windows with glass. At best, there were small, unglazed openings with wooden shutters to keep out the worst of the elements, plunging the interior into near-total darkness when closed. And you would not be living in this smoky, dark space alone. You would share it with your entire immediate family, parents, spouse, children. Privacy was a concept that did not exist. Every conversation, every argument, every moment of intimacy or illness was public within the family unit. But it wasn't just your human family. To protect them from theft or predators, peasants often brought their most valuable animals, a cow, a few sheep or chickens, inside the hut at night. Now let's consider the water you would drink. With no concept of sanitation, the local water sources, streams, rivers, or shallow wells, were heavily contaminated. All human and animal waste from the village eventually found its way into the water table. Drinking this water meant you were constantly ingesting a cocktail of bacteria, including E. coli, cholera, and typhoid. The air you breathe is thick with the scent of wood smoke, of damp wool, of livestock, and of the raw, untamed earth. It is an aroma of survival, clinging to your hair and your simple clothes. The evening meal would be the main meal of the day, though it offered little more variety than the others. This is when the perpetual pottage would be at its most substantial, with fresh vegetables from the garden plot, known as a toft, added to the simmering pot. This small garden was crucial for survival. It provided the onions, leeks, cabbages, and peas that supplemented the grain-heavy diet. As darkness falls, so does a profound quiet and an immense blackness that is hard for us to imagine. There is no street lighting. The world outside your hut is pitch black. The main source of light inside would be the flickering glow of the central fire. Tallow candles made from animal fat were a luxury and would be used sparingly. This deep darkness governed the rhythm of life. Once the sun went down, most work ceased, and the family would gather around the fire. Let us delve deeper into the structure of your life, which was entirely dictated by the feudal system. You were not a free person in any modern sense of the word. Most peasants were serfs, which meant you were legally bound to the land you worked. You could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. You could not marry someone from another village without his consent, and often the payment of a fee. You could not send your son to be educated in the church without the lord's approval. These obligations were numerous and burdensome. We've mentioned the corvée labor, the days spent working the lord's personal fields known as the domain. But there was also the tithe, a 10% tax on all your produce, which went to the church. After the tithe and the portion for the Lord were taken, you were left with what remained to feed your family and save for seed for the next planting. Then there were the fees. Justice for you would not be an impartial system. It would be administered through the manorial court, presided over by the Lord or his steward. This court handled local disputes, petty crimes, and the enforcement of the Lord's regulations. If you were accused of a crime like poaching or theft, you would be judged by your fellow villagers, a jury of your peers. While this sounds fair, the reality was that the entire system was weighted in favor of the Lord. Now let's talk about your health and the medical care you would receive. The average life expectancy was brutally short, around 30 to 35 years. This number is skewed by an incredibly high infant mortality rate. Perhaps as many as 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, but your body would be worn out by a lifetime of hard labor and poor nutrition. The diet, as we've touched upon, was a primary cause of poor health. The lack of variety and essential nutrients led to chronic conditions. A diet overwhelmingly reliant on bread and grains, with few fresh fruits or vegetables, meant that scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common, especially in winter. This led to rotting gums, tooth loss, and internal bleeding. Iron deficiency from the lack of meat caused anemia, leaving you perpetually weak and lethargic. The world you inhabit is governed by a profound and all-encompassing faith. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. and its influence touched every aspect of your life. The village priest was a figure of immense authority, the conduit to God. The church building itself was likely the only stone structure in your village, a symbol of permanence and divinity amidst the transient, mud-and-wood reality of your own life. Your year was structured around the liturgical calendar. Life was a cycle of work, punctuated by holy days or holidays. Festivals like Christmas and Easter were major events, providing a much-needed respite from labor. These were times of feasting relative to the daily fare, drinking, and communal celebration. On these days, the Lord might provide extra food and ale, and the entire village would gather for church services, followed by games, dancing, and music. Alongside the formal teachings of the church, your mind would be filled with a rich tapestry of folklore and superstition. The line between religion and folk belief was often blurry. You believed in the power of saints' relics to heal and protect, but you might also believe in fairies, goblins, and mischievous spirits that could curdle milk or lead travelers astray. You would use charms and amulets to ward off the evil eye. In this world, the forest is not a park for recreation. It is a place of vital resources and hidden dangers, a realm of folklore where spirits and outlaws were said to dwell just beyond the tree line. Let's consider the psychological toll of this existence. You live with a constant, low-level anxiety. The weather is your biggest and most unpredictable foe. A drought in summer could wither your crops in the field. A week of heavy rain during harvest could ruin the grain, leading to a winter of starvation. An early frost could wipe out a season's work overnight. You are utterly dependent on factors you cannot control, and a single bad harvest could be a death sentence for your family. Violence was an accepted and unremarkable part of life. While the Lord's court handled local disputes, the wider world was a dangerous place. The authority of kings was often weak, and local lords frequently feuded with one another. A dispute between your lord and a neighboring one could result in a raid on your village. A band of soldiers or mercenaries could descend to burn your crops, steal your livestock, and inflict violence upon the villagers. There was no police force to call. Now imagine famine. A few consecutive bad harvests caused by drought, flood, or war could exhaust the village's stored food supplies. When the grain ran out, the desperation was unimaginable. You would be forced to eat whatever you could find: tree bark, roots, acorns, and grass. Your livestock, your most precious assets, would be slaughtered for food. Malnutrition would give way to starvation. The community, once bound by solidarity, would begin to break down under the strain. And then there was the ultimate catastrophe, an event that dwarfed all other hardships: the Black Death. When the bubonic plague arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, it was an apocalyptic event. You would have no understanding of the bacteria or the fleas on rats that carried it. You would see it as a divine punishment of unimaginable scale. Let's return to the smaller, more personal details of your daily struggle. Your teeth, for instance. Without access to dental care or even a toothbrush, your oral hygiene would be non-existent. Your diet, while not high in sugar, was gritty and abrasive from the stone-ground flour, which would wear down your enamel. You would suffer from constant toothaches, abscesses, and gum disease. Losing teeth was a normal part of aging. An infected tooth could lead to a systemic infection, a fever, and death. Communication with the outside world was virtually non-existent. You were illiterate. The written word was the domain of the clergy and the nobility. News traveled slowly, passed by word of mouth from the rare traveler, pilgrim, or merchant who might pass through your village. This information would be inconsistent, often exaggerated, and weeks or months out of date. Your understanding of your country, your king, or the wider world was based entirely on rumor and legend. Let us talk about marriage and family. Marriage was not a romantic union. It was an economic and social contract. It was a partnership for survival. A husband and wife were a team, both contributing essential labor to the household economy. The wife's domain was the hut, the garden plot, and the raising of children, but she also worked in the fields during peak times like the harvest. What about your clothes? You would likely own only one or two outfits. These would be made of homespun wool or linen. The process of making cloth was incredibly labor-intensive, from shearing the sheep, to carding and spinning the wool into thread, to weaving it into cloth on a simple loom. This work was typically done by the women of the household during the winter months. The clothes were functional, not fashionable. They were designed for durability and warmth. The concept of a career or personal ambition was non-existent for a peasant. You were born into your station, and you would die in it. A son would learn to farm from his father, inheriting his strip of land and his obligations to the Lord. A daughter would learn the skills of a homemaker from her mother, expecting to marry a peasant from her own village or a neighboring one. There was a rigid social hierarchy and almost no mobility. Your hands are not soft. They are a record of your life, calloused and scarred from the plow, the scythe, and the axe. They are tools shaped by relentless, unending necessity. Let's consider the landscape you lived in. It was not the manicured countryside we see today. The fields were divided into long, narrow strips, with each family farming several strips scattered throughout the manor's common fields. This system was designed to ensure that each family had a mix of good and poor quality land. Beyond the fields lay the waste, uncultivated land of heath, moor, and marsh. This was common land where you could graze your livestock. And then there was the forest. It is crucial to understand that despite the immense hardship, peasant life was not devoid of agency or culture. Communities developed intricate systems of cooperation to manage the common fields and resources. Villagers helped each other during planting and harvest, and supported families who had fallen on hard times. The folklore, songs, and stories passed down through generations created a rich and vibrant oral culture. They found ways to celebrate, to mourn, and to endure together. So let's synthesize this. On your very first day, you would awaken in the cold and dark, in a smoky hut smelling of animals and unwashed bodies. You would relieve yourself in a way that is utterly foreign and unhygienic. You would eat a meager, unpalatable breakfast that would leave you hungry. You would then perform hours of grueling, monotonous physical labor that your body is completely unprepared for, risking serious injury with every movement. We must also confront the sensory overload. Our modern world is loud, but the medieval world had a different soundscape. The creak of wood, the lowing of oxen, the cry of birds, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But it's the smells that would be most shocking. The overpowering stench of animal and human waste, of unwashed bodies, of smoke, of rotting garbage, and of death and disease would be a constant assault on your senses. We are accustomed to sanitized, deodorized environments. The psychological shift required would be perhaps the greatest challenge of all. You would have to abandon the core tenets of modern individualism. Your life would not be about self-fulfillment, personal growth, or the pursuit of happiness. It would be about duty, obligation, and survival. You would need to suppress your own desires for the good of the family and the community. You would need to accept a worldview dominated by faith, superstition, and a rigid social hierarchy. To conclude our journey, it is clear that surviving a single day as a medieval peasant is not a matter of toughness or willpower. It is a matter of adaptation on every conceivable level: physical, biological, and psychological. A modern body, unconditioned to the labor and unacclimated to the pathogens, would likely fail within hours. Understanding their struggle is not about romanticizing poverty or glorifying suffering. It is about gaining a profound sense of perspective. The simple comforts we take for granted, a clean glass of water, a hot meal, a warm bed, the absence of chronic pain, the freedom to choose our own path in life, are the hard-won luxuries that our ancestors could only dream of, perhaps in their vision of heaven. Let's focus for a moment on the social fabric itself. While we've discussed community, it's important to grasp the lack of privacy this entailed. In your small village, everyone knew everyone else's business. There were no secrets. A marital dispute, a child's misbehavior, or a personal failing would become common knowledge, discussed and judged by your neighbors. This intense social scrutiny acted as a powerful enforcement mechanism for community norms. Consider the very concept of time. Our lives are governed by the minute and the second. The medieval peasant's life was governed by larger, more natural rhythms. Time was marked by the position of the sun, the call to prayer from the church bell lauds at sunrise, vespers at sunset, and the progression of the seasons. The year was not a sterile grid of months and days, but a living cycle of festivals and fasts, of plowing and harvesting. This different perception of time would be deeply disorienting. Let us explore the role of women in more detail. A peasant woman's life was one of relentless labor, often called the double burden. She was responsible for all domestic chores in an era where every task was manual and difficult. Grinding grain by hand if a mill wasn't available, baking bread, brewing the essential ale, a vital source of calories, making cheese and butter, tending the kitchen garden, and preserving food for the winter. The seasons are not mere changes in weather, they are tyrants. The planting in spring is a frantic race against time, and the harvest in autumn is a desperate prayer against an early frost or a devastating rain. Old age, should you be fortunate enough to reach it, was not a time of peaceful retirement. There were no pensions or social security. Your survival in your later years depended entirely on the support of your children. This is why having a family was not just a personal desire, but an economic necessity. An elderly person who had outlived their children or had none was in a desperate situation, reliant on the charity of the wider community or the church, which was often meager. Let's talk more about the tools that defined your labor. They were extensions of your body, but they were incredibly inefficient by modern standards. The heavy plow, or caruca, was a huge advancement over the earlier scratch plow, but it was still a beast to manage. It required a full team of 8 oxen, a massive investment that often necessitated several families pooling their animals. The mental world of the peasant was also shaped by a lack of education. Illiteracy was near universal among the peasantry. Knowledge was not acquired from books, but from experience, observation, and oral tradition. You learned to farm by watching your father. You learned about herbs from your mother. You learned about your faith from the priest's sermons and the images in the church. This created a powerful and resilient oral culture, but it also limited abstract and scientific thought. Let's consider the landscape of fear in more detail. We've mentioned war, famine, and disease, but there were more intimate, everyday fears. The fear of fire was profound. In a world of wooden huts with thatched roofs and open hearths, a single stray spark could destroy your home and everything in it in minutes. A fire could easily spread and consume an entire village. There was also the fear of animal predators. The relationship with animals was deeply practical and unsentimental. An ox was not a pet. It was a living tractor, the most valuable asset a family could own. Its health and strength were directly tied to your family's ability to eat. A cow provided milk, cheese, and butter, and its calf was a source of future wealth. Pigs were walking larders, foraging in the woods and converting scraps into meat. Chickens provided precious eggs. These animals were your partners in survival. The very air you breathed carried risks we can scarcely imagine. The smoke from the hearth was a slow poison for the lungs. But outside, the air was also filled with pathogens. The lack of waste management meant that refuse piles and animal dung were everywhere, drying in the sun, and the wind would carry dried, pulverized fecal matter containing bacteria and parasite eggs through the air. You would be breathing this in constantly. The idea of leisure is worth re-examining. While we've mentioned the holy day festivals, even these were not entirely free time. They were structured communal events with religious obligations. The modern idea of personal, unstructured leisure time, reading a book, watching a movie, pursuing a hobby for its own sake, did not exist. Any time not spent in obligatory labor was filled with other necessary tasks: mending tools, fetching water, tending the garden. Let us contemplate the sheer monotony of the diet in greater detail. The pottage was the constant. Day in, day out, it would be the same soupy, grainy mixture. The bread was always the same heavy, dark loaf. This lack of variety would not only lead to nutritional deficiencies, but also to a profound culinary boredom that is hard for us, with our globalized food supply, to appreciate. The system of land tenure, the open field system, had a profound impact on daily life. Your family's land was not in one convenient plot, but scattered in strips across several large fields. This meant you spent a significant amount of time simply walking between your strips to work them. This system, while ensuring a fair distribution of land quality, was incredibly inefficient. Furthermore, all decisions about what to plant and when to harvest had to be made communally. What if you had a particular talent or skill? What if you were a gifted woodcarver or had a sharp mind for numbers? In the rigid structure of peasant society, there were very few outlets for such talents. Your destiny was to be a farmer. A good woodcarver might be able to make better tools or decorations for the church, earning some communal respect, but it would not change your fundamental status as a serf bound to the land.